Hello students, welcome back. So today we are going to talk about rhythm. So before we get in, let's talk about what rhythm actually is. So we have so far discussed how to represent pitch on the staff, and now we're going to show how long you are going to play a single pitch for. So it doesn't really help you play a certain melody if you just see a bunch of pitches, because there's a lot of different ways you could sing or play those pitches. You want to hold each one for a certain amount of time to give the actual melody that you're looking for. And these are the symbols that we're going to use for that. So we have some pretty basic ones that are fairly straightforward, and then we have some more complex ones, and we'll get into those as we go. To begin with, it's really just simple fractional math. So if we start off with this top one up here, this circle, that is a whole note. And a whole of what, you might ask. We will have to talk about that later. As we go, that'll make more sense. But for now, just accept that a whole note is a whole of something. It is the entirety of something. And if we cut the whole note in half, that is a half note. So we have an open circle with a little stem coming off of it. We can cut the half note in half as well to get a quarter note, which is going to be the filled in circle with the stem. Then we have the filled in circle with the stem and a little flag. That's our eighth note. And then filled in circle, stem, two little flags, a 16th note. And we can actually keep going all the way down as far as we want. We can do 32nd notes. We can do 64th notes. Anything we want. Just keep adding little flags to that. Typically, you're not going to see much more than a 32nd note. In this class, you'll probably not see anything lower than a 16th note. But they are there, they do exist, okay? Now on the left-hand side, I don't know if this is left for you, it might be mirroring on the actual video. On my screen here it's mirrored, so it looks like it would, no, it's still the left on the, anyway. On this side, you have a rest version of this. So just like we need a way to represent pitch for a certain amount of time, we need to be able to represent silence for a certain amount of time. So each of these has a corresponding rest symbol. So this line with a little box under it, that is a whole note rest. This line with a little hat, the hat is for a half note. The quarter note has the little Harry Potter lightning bolt. The eighth note is easy to remember because it has the little flag as well. 16th note, same pattern applies, you just keep adding little flags, okay? So they look pretty strange if they're totally new to you, but you'll get used to them as you go. Now, what do these mean in terms of what we actually hear? So if I represent each one as a clap, and let's say I want to play a quarter note followed by two eighth notes, the eighth notes are going to be half the duration of the quarter note. So if our quarter note is an eighth note, will be like this. I just doubled the speed there. So we can go the other way too. If our quarter note is, our half note is just twice the length, okay? And that goes all the way up. I'm not going to clap a whole note because I'll end up just sitting here for a while, but you get the picture. So you're really just dividing how quickly you're clapping, playing a note, doing whatever it is you are doing that the music is asking you to for this amount of time. And the interesting thing about this way of representing time is it's all relative to itself. So you could imagine, and there are scores out there that will say that it's for a certain number of seconds, or the entire piece has to occur within this many minutes. And that is pretty complicated to do. It's difficult to get everybody synced into a certain number of seconds. So this system right here allows all of it to be self-contained. It references itself. A half note is a half because it's half of a whole. That makes sense? But so if you can figure out exactly what your quarter note beat is, then you can figure out what all of these other ones are. And you don't need to know how many seconds it will go on for. And typically when you're looking at a piece of music, it will tell you what the actual beat is, how fast it should be. The value of a quarter note in beats per minute is usually what it gives. We don't need to worry about that too much right now. We're just trying to do some simple math with these. Okay, so let's look at some of these more complex ones. So here on this side, we're talking about things that are all basically halves of the previous. Half is half of a whole, quarter is half of a half, eighth is half of an eighth, 16th half of an eighth. You just keep dividing by 2 all the way down. But you can do more than that. So let's look at this first one. So the first thing to notice is this little smiley face underneath it. That's called a tie. And what the tie does is it extends the duration of something. So if I just had these two next to each other without the smiley face, this one you would hear each of these distinctly. So it's awkward because the clapping has very little sustain. It doesn't have a duration. But if we imagine this is our quarter note, that symbol is going to sound like this. So again, the sustain of a clap doesn't really illustrate this well, but if they were separated, no tie that is, you would play each separately. What the tie means is that you put them together. Let me draw an example here. So if I do that, okay, with a little tie between that. So what this is going to sound like is 1, 3, 4. So it's hear how it goes off at the end there. I don't think that was exactly right, but you get the picture. So this one is basically going to be a little bit longer than the quarter note itself. Specifically, how longer depends on what it's tied to. So in this case, it's a quarter tied to an eighth. So you're just going to add the values together. We could describe this as being 3/8 notes, for example. Okay? Now, it's the nebulous part about this whole discussion is the discussion of time and the discussion of half of something or a whole of something, and this something we don't know what it is yet. So really all that you need to understand is that a dotted quarter note is equal to 1.5 quarter notes, or as I'm representing it here, a quarter note tied to an eighth note. Okay, so this dot, to summarize, means that you extend the duration of that value by half of it. Okay, so if I have a dotted half note, for example, the dotted half note is equal to 1.5 half notes. So a half note tied to a quarter note. Okay? And you can put this little dot next to any of these values. Okay, you could have a dotted 16th note, in which case it is 1.5 16th notes, or 3 32nd notes, however you want to say that. It is 1.5 of whatever the dot is connected to. Okay? It gets even more tricky when we start adding another dot. So if you add 2 dots, it is the original plus half of its duration plus half of that duration. So in this case, let me fill that in a little bit better. Okay, so we have a quarter note with 2 dots, so that's going to be a quarter note tied to an eighth note, so half of its value, tied to a 16th note, half of that value. Okay, so it is half of the first value. So this dot refers, lost the whiteboard again. I think that's going to happen every video or so. This dot refers to that note there. The second dot refers to the first dot. Okay? So let me illustrate that down here. Yeah, you can see that. Okay, so we have 2 dots there. So for our first, we're going to take the original value, and then we're going to add to it half of its value. So half of a quarter is an eighth. And then we're going to add half of that value. Half of an eighth is a 16th. Okay? So it's a bit confusing when you first start looking at it, but once you've practiced it a bit, it's really basic math. My watch is happy with me. Okay? The last one I want to show you is the triplet. Okay, so in the triplet, you're basically taking 3 of something and fitting it into the space where there would be 2. So a half note can also be shown as 3 triplet rhythms. Okay, so if our quarter note sounds like this, Then a triplet would be. Okay, so that's the trickiest one. It really falls outside of our typical beats. It's easiest to hear as an example. I'll see if I can find a few examples of this actually happening, and I'll put that along with the video so you can hear it more clearly. These are all a lot easier to understand if you can hear them. So all I'm trying to get across here in this video is the math behind it. And all you really need to see is what these symbols are, what they represent, and then on this side, each one is just half of the previous, and then we can do a little bit more complex math, like doing 1.5 of something, or 1.5 and a fourth of something, or dividing something by 3 here. Okay, so that's why these are the more complex ones. It starts to be a little bit strange. Just bear with me on that for now. Understand the math behind it, and once we start the next lesson, that will make a lot more sense. Okay? Sweet.